I'd love to introduce our first guest, Anan Quzmar. He is an independent Tulkarem-based journalist / researcher in the West Bank. Anan, welcome.
Shukran. Thank you for having me.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on. And, Gaza has obviously been one of the major headlines because of the horrific genocide that's been taking place there for over a year. We've had you on before to discuss the targeted attacks on journalists in Gaza, which continue till now. But because the violence in Gaza is just so atrocious and grotesque, it's really overshadowed the horrific, unprecedented levels of violence taking place across the West Bank. So can you kind of give us a breakdown, a kind of brief explanation of the violence that we're seeing taking place in the West Bank, and how much of that is related to recent statements we've heard by the finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, of Israel, talking about wanting to annex the West Bank and officially make it part of Israel?
These calls and plans for the annexation of the West Bank are being treated as almost like a new milestone, while I think it's rather a natural outcome of two long-standing things. First, ideological trajectories within the Israeli leadership that basically have continuously called for and implemented on the ground measures that entrench the Israeli occupation and internally displace and even externally displace Palestinians across the West Bank, trying to cram Palestinians in as small area as possible. That plan has been happening since practically day one of the occupation, more than 55 years ago. And the other long-standing factor driving this is the continued international support that Israel enjoys and helps Israel by preventing any form of accountability for the crimes that the prolonged occupation of the West Bank involves. So these are the two main drivers, and this is a natural progression rather than somehow a turning point in the history of the West Bank. In terms of the increased attacks, again, we see the media focusing on attacks that take place inside Palestinian areas, perhaps because that's where the majority of the population are, but these attacks have never stopped, particularly in so-called Area C, where Palestinians are prevented from merely inhabiting their own lands, whether that's construction, farming, or any other economic activity. In terms of even the attacks against the cities, this is a trend that has started a long time ago, well before October 7. For example, the first incursion that involved bulldozers attacking infrastructure in the city of Tulkarem, where I live, took place in May 2023. And even though these attacks have increased in intensity and frequency since October 7th, in terms of the pattern of behavior for the army, it's largely the same. Elsewhere, I have, particularly when I'm writing about this, I've talked about an element that suggests that there is some sort of a practice or training for the Israeli army to withhold Palestinian cities and hold large numbers of Palestinians inside these cities under curfew and basically keep them under control for a prolonged period of time. And that pattern was quite obvious in 2023, where the army would come in certain incursions and stay for a few hours, and always the next incursion would involve a longer period, perhaps also larger areas of the city that are directly targeted. For example, in the city of Tulkarem in 2023, there was 70 people who were killed by these attacks. In 2024, so far, we have 125. Obviously, Tulkarem is one of the main cities that are being targeted, but the number of those killed across the West Bank in 2023 was over 500. And so far in 2024, we are talking about almost 500 also. A large percentage of those are civilians, over 160 children included. These incursions, particularly in Tulkarem, other than attacking infrastructure, involve also cutting water and electricity for prolonged periods of time. The main focus of attacks in Tulkarem in particular is the refugee camps, where we have two refugee camps, Tulkarem refugee camp and Nur Shams refugee camp, both of which host close to 30,000 people, or used to hold 30,000 people. But with the increased intensity of these attacks and the accumulative impact of the attacks against infrastructure, a lot of people who used to reside in refugee camps have sought temporary residence outside. They maybe try and maintain some sort of presence during the day, but as soon as there is news of a new Israeli incursion in the city, you will see lots of people fleeing for their temporary residence because it has become increasingly difficult for them to stay under curfew, let alone obviously the random house-to-house searches and mass arrests that are carried out. The incursions happen now at a frequency where even basic repairs of water infrastructure, electricity are not even completed. So even though the news about these attacks, they filter out somehow to the media while they're happening, but between these attacks, thousands of people are forced to live without the most basic necessities that they need.
One thing you emphasized and you've seen in those videos right there is the repeated attacks on infrastructure, on life infrastructure, water, electricity. There were videos of, D9 bulldozers tearing up roads. And, the interesting thing is, the Israelis have been prepping this narrative that they're going to escalate in the West Bank, and they of course are, by saying that they're conducting anti-terrorism operations, no different than they said in Gaza, oh, we're just fighting terrorists, where now we clearly see there's, the Israelis are actively destroying all the life infrastructure and expelling Palestinians from Gaza. Do you think they're pursuing a similar style strategy in the West Bank?
Well, it's really difficult for me to comment on what's going on in Gaza, particularly with the attacks against journalists that have basically prevented us from seeing the full picture of what's going on there. But from the lived reality that we have here in Tulkarem, it's quite obvious that the main focus, the overall focus of these attacks is the collective punishment. Whether that collective punishment is pursuing specific practical goals or sending a message to the population in the West Bank that they are next, that the West Bank is not a safe place for them to be. That's up for discussion. But while it's perhaps wrong to deny that there is a certain level of resistance during these incursions, and part of these incursions target the insurgency, as they call it, local insurgency, I would say that the large majority of these acts are purposeful collective punishment and nothing else. In fact, if anything, if you want to weigh the impact or the overall impact of these incursions in Palestinian cities, you will find that there is more indirect recruitment for insurgency than there is counter-insurgency, in the sense where you take the basic infrastructure away from thousands, if not tens of thousands of people. You are forcing more people into desperate situation where they are more likely to pick up guns and try and resist. And with also the frequency and intensity of these attacks is definitely impacting a wider, almost purposefully, if not. This is not what the Israeli army would admit to, but this is what the observations suggest clearly. Then I think it's ridiculous that Israel is allowed to do this, and I think living through one incursion in Tulkarem can give you this message and erase any doubt, if anybody had any doubt about the underlying intentions of these incursions. For example, the incursions, as you mentioned, they include D9 and sometimes also D10 bulldozers, which are considerably bigger also. The incursion starts with the bulldozers ahead of the convoy. So any counter-insurgency operations would probably require at least some element of surprise, or you would think that the army would be more in a rush to reach the targeted areas, while basically every man and his dog can know that the army is advancing 40, maybe sometimes more than 40 minutes before they actually reach your area. Uh, there is, for example, nothing preventing the army from invading the city or raiding the city at a quicker pace and have the bulldozers arrive maybe later. But this is not the common practice here. So the only reason that Israel can get away with this sort of messaging is because international media likes to take the statements of the Israeli army at face value, despite the fact that it doesn't take much investigation to at least punch some holes in this argument. And when they rarely host and question Israeli officials about this, they never actually challenge the official narrative that they try and give out during these interviews.
Yeah, I think it's important just to clarify, as you have been saying. I mean, the whole idea here is Israel's destroying homes, pushing people off their land to take their land, just like Israel does everywhere else in Palestine. And obviously, that creates people who resist that. And then it also becomes, quote unquote, counterinsurgency, counterterrorism to try to get rid of any resistance to land theft. And all that's to say, you talked about an increase in intensity. And something we've seen specifically this year in the West Bank has been airstrikes. And just last month in October, I think, right, early October, there was an airstrike on Tulkarem refugee camp that killed like 18 people. I mean, it was the sort of airstrike you see in Gaza or South Lebanon. At this point. So I think it was really striking to see that take place in the West Bank because it was actually with a fighter jet. So I'm just curious if you can talk a bit about the significance of that level of intensity in terms of Israel's military campaign in the West Bank.
Right. We've seen the Israeli army use airstrikes in the West Bank using drones over the last 2 years. Actually, a couple of incidents took place before October 2023. But the use of drones has increased in frequency and intensity, of course, over the last year. But the strike that you mentioned, which killed at least 18 people in Tulkarem refugee camp, took place using a fighter jet, an F-16, according to media reports. And this was the first use of F-16 in the West Bank in over 20 years since the Second Intifada, as it's commonly known. But it also came after a public declaration by the Israeli army that when they announced wide-scale military operation in the north of the West Bank about a month and a half ago, or even more than that, it did refer to basically changing the rules of engagement and allowing for the use of the Air Force in a more free way for the Israeli army. These sort of attacks taking place inside a crowded refugee camp are obviously not just in violation to international law, but also reveal that the Israeli army is basically being pushed by the political apparatus in Israel to basically carry out more aggressive attacks against Palestinians.
Well, Anan Quzmar, independent Tulkarem-based journalist and researcher, I want to thank you for joining us to break all of this down. Stay safe out there, and we look forward to having you back on soon.
Sure. Thank you very much.